Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, the show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host Graham, and today I'm speaking with Malcolm Garrett in person from a studio in Shoreditch. Malcolm Garrett is an iconic British graphic designer. He's best known for the record sleeves he designed during the 70s and 80s for punk and rock groups like Duran Duran, the Buzzcocks and Magazine, amongst many others. I became interested in Malcolm's work pretty much the same time as I decided to go to art college to study graphic design. He was one of the iconic graphic designers of that period, sitting alongside Peter Saville, Neville Brody. Malcolm's work and name was certainly something that inspired me to go to art college to study graphic design. Something that struck me during our interview was how incredibly down-to-earth Malcolm is, despite his accomplishments. I think that's certainly something to do with his upbringing. Coming from Manchester, he's very humble, despite the fact that he rubbed shoulders with rock stars in the past. Here's a moment from our interview that captures this sentiment.
I liked to associate myself with people who did things other than what I did. And so Assorted Images was never a studio that was just Malcolm Garrett and some clones. It was a studio that had lots of other designers, many of whom were better designers than me.
Here to preview this episode with me is my co-host, Carl. Hi, Carl.
Hi, Graham. I think we're supposed to banter now.
Do some banter. Oh, we usually do that thing. How are you, my fine, outstanding colleague?
Indeed. Yes, my incredible creative director. Graham, I'm super excited for this episode. This is probably my favorite era of graphic design, which is a really kind of nerdy thing to say, is that I have a favorite era of graphic design, but I love everything that came out of that first wave of punk and new wave or post-punk music. It's just it's so vibrant and dynamic and fun.
It really was a fertile era. If you think of Peter Saville for Factory Records and New Order, Neville Brody, Cabaret Voltaire, such a fantastic body of work.
Yeah. So you mentioned you got into Malcolm's work as you were going into college. Were you also checking out some of these bands and artists at that time? Was there a musical connection for you personally?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I probably tapped into his work after the initial kind of post-punk work that he did for the Buzzcocks. So, he was working in the record industry and still does. But at that period in the 80s, he was producing covers for the big bands of the time. So Culture Club, Duran Duran, Heaven 17. Those were the kind of things that I was listening to and were being played around me at that time. And I was really inspired by the covers.
It's funny. So I was born in 1982, so I was not conscious for a lot of that early stuff. But a lot of the music I got into as a teenager, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, bands like that, were huge fans of the Ramones, the Clash, the Buzzcocks, bands like that. So they were kind of a way into that era for me. And then that led to the graphic design that was part of that scene as well. So it's just it's funny how things go around and come around. What was unique about Malcolm's work at the time, or kind of what helped him stand out and achieve the status he did, in your opinion?
Well, that's something I've only learned later and actually speaking with him. So visually, his covers are kind of outstanding, but I learned recently at an exhibition that he held in London on Duran Duran that he created visual identities around his artists. So Duran Duran, for instance, he was creating their record covers almost as a system or a brand. And I think that that's something that really set him apart from other artists who are maybe creating kind of graphics for covers. He was actually thinking about how to package the band or the artist. And I loved that approach because obviously I've worked in branding a lot and I see it now. I didn't see it at the time. I just saw amazing covers that popped out at me, kind of great imagery. But, the layer beyond that is really clever in terms of branding the artists themselves.
Yeah, well, that's definitely persisted in the music industry in the decades since then. So you mentioned too that this episode was recorded in Shoreditch, which is where our office is. And it's a pretty cool coincidence because Malcolm has a long history in Shoreditch as well.
He does. Malcolm had his own company, Assorted Images, for a long time, which was based in Shoreditch. I think they first opened up shop in 1983, and Shoreditch was a very different place back then. He was also one of the first kind of pioneers of kind of digital and interactive design as well. He's such a fascinating character, and I hope people really enjoy this episode because he's so enthusiastic, vibrant, and he's done so much.
Yeah. Well, what do you say we get onto that episode and turn things over to you and the iconic, legendary Malcolm Garrett?
Welcome to Monotype Creative Characters. We're here today with Malcolm Garrett, iconic British graphic designer, I must say. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Malcolm. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's a pleasure to be here, I hope.
We were introduced to each other by Brian Edmondson from C Design,
right,
who kind of seems to be like the Cilla Black of the design world. He's an amazing connector. So thank you very much, Brian. And before that, actually, via one of their events at the C studio space, just around the corner from here.
Not far from here.
Yeah. You held an exhibition about your design for Duran Duran.
Well, to be fair, Brian held the exhibition.
But it was about your work for Duran Duran.
But it was about my work for Duran Duran.
Yeah, and sadly, you actually couldn't be at the exhibition yourself.
Well, I attended by FaceTime from my hospital bed. It was a couple of days before I was due to have heart surgery, which was a bit dramatic.
Yeah, understandable you couldn't be there then.
It was very understandable. And it also meant that everybody who was at the exhibition had to enjoy it. They weren't allowed to kind of have any critical thoughts about it.
But it was a great exhibition. I lived through a lot of those albums that you created the covers for and essentially the brand for Duran Duran. But I didn't have any inkling at all about the way that you actually approached the design for Duran Duran. And it was actually as a brand identity. And that was something really revealing and really interesting for me. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, I guess I didn't really kind of call it that. I just wanted to introduce some kind of consistency and continuation from one record release to the next, but also to use the packaging or the graphic environment around each release as the starting point for a much bigger. It's something that kind of developed. I started work in the music industry 3 or 4 years before I met Duran Duran. And in that period of time, I'd kind of evolved a way of working in the music industry that hadn't really existed before. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, but it wasn't really the case that the record sleeve designer, for instance, would be the designer of the press ads or the posters. And it was early days for merchandise, so there wasn't even the merchandise. And as that range of opportunities for exploring a graphic identity presented itself, then I got very excited by that. And Duran Duran were the perfect vehicle. So I was given the opportunity. I worked with them pretty much day to day for 6 years, nonstop. And in that time, we developed quite a few albums, quite a few singles, and quite a few tour campaigns. And they were determinedly international. And so the opportunities that presented themselves were just something that, as a graphic designer, were just like, they were made for me.
Yeah, I love that. And it became kind of clear to me, seeing that exhibition, that you got this great instinct for turning pop culture into design language and that brand approach. I really loved that. If you could collect and rebrand one entire cultural universe, past or present, what would it be? And what story would you tell through design?
I don't really know. Despite being a graphic designer, and the very nature of graphic design is coordinating visual responses to things on behalf of other people, the corollary of that is the material isn't mine. So one of the great things about being a graffiti designer, and also one of the difficult things, was that you never really knew what you were going to be asked to do tomorrow. And so it was always exciting. And so from that perspective, I never really thought about or developed any frustrations for not being presented with something I really wanted to do, because I never really knew what I really wanted to do. I knew I loved music, and I knew I loved this musician rather than that musician, for instance. And meeting new musicians generally gave you new opportunities, and because you're just meeting new people. It's all about people. So I was always ready for the unexpected. So in some ways, I can't answer that question. There's no burning issue that I ever really wanted to address. I mean, some burning issues presented themselves to me, and I was able to address them, but I didn't lie awake at night thinking, oh God, I hope person X or company Y calls me tomorrow because I really got to do that. That's not what drives me.
Okay, yeah, I get that. But I think it's your response to the opportunities that came along which kind of really stand out to me. That you took Duran Duran and kind of packaged them in a way as a brand, which was really interesting.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm sort of quite a contradictory person. And what I mean by that is when something's presented to me, I'll think of a different way of looking at it. So if it's suggested, let's do this, I'll say, no, why don't we do that? And so with music packaging, as you say, I really did think of it as packaging. And right from the start, I kind of thought, well, why can't this band look like a bank? So one of the first album sleeves I ever designed, I took the NatWest Bank, the National Westminster Bank, as a reference point and tried to take inspiration from the kind of graphic materials a bank would need and use those same reference points for a punk band. And so with Duran, it started with, well, I knew that the name Duran Duran came from a character in
Barbarella.
In Barbarella,
yeah.
Yes. Thank you for plugging into my missing brain. So I was always a big science fiction fan. And the first single was called Planet Earth. And you never really know how these things come together. But it seemed logical to me that a band that was inspired by a character in a futuristic film about a woman on another planet singing a very stylized, because they were at the beginning of the whole new romantic movement, singing a very stylized song about looking at the world from above. That made me think, oh, Duran Duran, that's TWA, isn't it? They're an airliner. It's Pan Am. It just seemed to say world transport, world airline transport. And that sort of became the starting point for the graphics. I didn't ever really want to pastiche the idea of an airline, but just the kind of general graphic flavor of an airline seemed to work. And again, airlines really developed through the 50s and the 60s, which were some of the high points of branding for corporations. And so it all just seemed to fit together in a kind of let's take it from here kind of way.
And the band kind of were really receptive to that, I take it. I spoke to John Taylor and Nick Rhodes of Duran Duran. They were at the event, which was amazing, and they were glowing about the kind of partnership that you had.
Well, as I say, they weren't allowed to criticize me because I wasn't there. But, we had our ups and downs over the years. But yes, I wasn't very many years older than them. We were all young, which is great. When you're young and enthusiastic and you're given the opportunity to work with good material or generate good material, your enthusiasm takes over and you do what you think is best. And so they were doing what they thought best as musicians with their first recorded works. And I thought I knew the right way of approaching it. And sometimes it all just works. It all just clicks. And that was one of those cases. And then you look back on it in nostalgic terms and go, yeah, it was a great period. We never had any disagreement. Everybody liked everything. But to be honest, I can't really remember the detail of any of the conversations we would have had at that time. I just have this kind of idealized memory of how things went, because I was introduced to them by EMI, their record label.
Okay.
And I can't even remember at what point I first met John and Nick or any of the band. I met their music and I met their record label first, and then it all kind of gelled from there.
When we met recently at Monotype Pencil to Pixel event, which was at C Design, it was great to kind of talk a little bit about the approach to this recording today. And I was keen that we didn't have a kind of a chronological approach to it. And that was really appealing to you as well.
That works for me, yes.
Yeah, and I'm glad it does, because I think it would be really nice to kind of maybe dance around a little bit and find some topics to talk about. And there's one thing that popped up on Instagram. I'm going to show you a picture, and for the benefit of our audience, who can't see the picture, it's a lovely picture which Hugh Miller, who's just drawn Pentagram, posted. It's of you and Neville Brody.
My old friend Neville.
Yeah, and yes. It's such a lovely picture. But I'm just curious to know, what do you talk about when you meet each other? Is it like, oh, not you again? Or
we moan about the industry.
Yeah.
We bitch about other designers. No, I mean, what do two designers talk about? They talk about things they've seen and what they're up to, pretend they're really busy and being really successful. The truthful answer is, I can't remember what we were talking about. I guess we were talking about how good it was to see one another, because I don't think I've seen Neville before that evening for several years.
Okay.
I've known him since pretty much the same time as I met Duran Duran. I was art directing a magazine called New Sounds, New Styles, a magazine that was launched by my still partner, Casper de Graaf, to document the new musical scene that was happening with Duran Duran. And I remember we wanted to expand the scope of the magazine into beyond just music and more into culture and lifestyle and the arts in general. And I wanted to kind of explore some of the themes that my contemporaries, other graphic designers working in the music industry, were exploring on their record sleeves. So I knew of Neville. Can't recall exactly why I'd heard his name, but I knew of him, and he just started working in the back room at The Face. He wasn't yet fully art directing the whole thing. And I called him up and I went over to see him, so that we could show some of his work and quote him in an article in New Sounds and New Styles.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So we've been friends ever since, because, he's more contrary than I am. But we've always felt passionate about the work we do and the area we work in, wanting to both be rebellious and influential and kind of forge our own pathway to do things that we think are important. So we've always seen eye to eye in that regard.
There's one other thing you mentioned when we met, that you've never been an employee and you've always kind of
I've always
done
been
your own thing
by myself.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that. And I'd love to know why you did it and how you've managed to kind of maintain that.
Again, it's that thing of I've never planned anything. I've never planned a career. We were talking earlier, is there anyone I would love to work with? No idea. I'm sure there are if I really kind of searched around. But I started working with some people who became friends of mine who had a punk band called Buzzcocks in Manchester when I was at the art school. I impressed upon them that they needed to work with a graphic designer to take care of their visual presentation. And that led to me working with another band called Magazine, and then from there, other bands. And so by the time I graduated from Manchester School of Art, I had a body of work that was in the public domain. Record sleeves had been released. So when I left art school, that's what I carried on to do. I forged stronger relationships with the record companies who had been employing me, and they gave me more work. And so I moved into that space. I literally moved from Manchester to London because at that point there really wasn't a music industry to speak of in Manchester. Factory records had yet to be formed. So I carried on doing that. And what that meant was, as a designer, I did all of my growing up in public. Because of the nature of the music industry and the nature of the music industry as it was at that time, where record companies were always ready to say yes to what these kind of punk bands that they didn't understand wanted to do, then effectively every single design I presented was accepted and put into print. Everything. There was no process as such whereby I had to submit ideas that somebody above me might have a comment on and change or modify or reject. Everything I wanted to do got done. And that was compounded by the speed of production in the music industry. And certainly that was the case with going back to Duran Duran. That was the case. The first single was, we've just signed this band. They're called Duran Duran. They're fantastic. They're going to be huge. The first single is called Planet Earth. We want to get it out as soon as possible. We need a sleeve by next Monday. I did a sleeve. and so there was no series of different ideas I'd present and there was no, can we change the size of that type, or don't really want it in white, can we have it in yellow? There's none of that. I just said, this is what the sleeve should look like, and they said, great. And it got printed. And that was the case for pretty much 100% of the things that I did for probably the first couple of years, if not more. And so I guess I was fortunate in that some of those things I did were quite successful. So I was able to build my freelance career literally from day one, which led to where you came in with the question. I never had to work for anyone. I just worked for myself.
Now, that kind of brings me to thinking about another topic that we discussed as well, which was your recent talk at St. Bride's. The approach was talking about your mistakes rather than the iconic work. And I'd love to know more about that.
The talk is called Growing Up in Public. And it's an interesting thing in that most of my work, as I say, has been seen in the public domain. Some of it's successful, especially stuff for bands like Duran Duran. And that's what people tend to know you for, what they've seen that was good and survived. The things that weren't so good, that weren't successful, nobody's seen them. And I just thought it'd be funny that whenever I give a talk, it's like, oh, here's Malcolm's greatest hits. And I'm not saying I get bored talking about what a great sleeve Rio is, but there are other things. And this whole notion of growing up in public prompted me to think, okay, well, what does that mean? That means that actually, in reality, there must have been quite a few things that even though they got printed, they were designed quickly and they got printed, they weren't successful, so people haven't seen them. And actually, in my view, that's probably a good thing because they weren't that good or they weren't good enough. I think that's the point, because you're young and enthusiastic, you've got no time to develop an idea and you haven't yet developed the skills to realize an idea in the way it looks in your head on the paper in front of you. And I just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to show a lot of those sleeves that people haven't seen and say, what do you think of this? I think it's awful. And I guess, after 50 years in the industry, you can be brave. You can show the shit.
Yeah. From my own experience, I think most designers have a drawer where they keep the concepts which haven't been passed through for approval, but they love them. And I'm sure it's probably that case, isn't it?
No, because as I say, generally I wouldn't present multiple options. I would just go, this is what it is. And the idea might have been good enough. The execution might have been appalling, but nevertheless it got printed. So that doesn't find its way into the drawer that was like, oh, I loved this all along. I kind of have two minds about it because, I'm just visualizing some of the record sleeves I've got in mind. You just think, oh, if only I'd done that properly. It is actually quite a good idea, but the way it's come out is terrible. So there aren't many instances where I had to present a range of different options. The one time I did do that, and I do have a collection of also-rans, is I was invited by the fantastic design company Hypnosis. Their sleeves were photographic, by and large. When they wanted something more graphic or typographic, they worked with other designers, most famously with George Hardy, who did the Dark Side of the Moon sleeve and lots of fantastic work. I mean, George was amazing. And they asked me to come up with some ideas for the last studio recordings of Led Zeppelin after John Bonham died. And they wanted to put out as a final epitaph, if you like, these are the last recorded works. And the album was called Coda, and they wanted it typographic. So I submitted, I don't know, maybe about 10 different ideas, 10 different designs with the word Coda on, and they chose one, and that's the one that's still being sold now. But the others, they got put into a drawer, and some of them were quite good. They actually saw the light of day relatively recently when Led Zeppelin went through all of their back catalogue and took each album by album, and did a box set of outtakes and other related material. So if you find the box set for Coda, you can see all of the other record sleeve designs.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I think that's the only time I can remember in all of those years that happened, that I did literally, 12-inch squares with lettering on. I mean, it was a very straightforward brief. So almost unlike the way I work. And some of them were good.
That brings me on nicely to, you have an amazing archive. You've collected sorts. Oh, okay. Well, I was told it was an amazing archive by Brian. So,
well, he's imagining it. Two important things to remember about me is that I never throw anything away, but I don't store it properly. Again, it's a question of space, time, dedication. So I ended up with garages and back rooms and lockups full of things that never got thrown away. For every job we did, it's not like it digital now. Now you have all digital files that you can't find. Back then you had literally pieces of paper and bits of cardboard in what we call job bags. And so at the end of a job, all the bits and pieces ended up in a job bag, but you're already on the next job. So nobody went through the job bag and decided what to keep and what not to keep. So sort of kept everything. And so there's a lot of job bags that need sorting through. And it's 50 years worth of them. Well, it's not 50 years because obviously for the past 30 years it's been digital. But it's an awful lot of stuff, and it's all ended up in a big warehouse space in Rochdale. And so I'm determined that 2026 will be the year that I start to go through all of this vast amount of material and find out, in the first place, hopefully, find out that we've got some good stuff, and also find out that there's some empty spaces. Because quite often things didn't come back from the printer or from wherever literally you'd do a piece of cardboard-based artwork and you'd send it to print, and that might be the last time you ever saw it until it was printed and in the shops. The actual mechanical artwork didn't come back to you. And the type of designer I was not generating photographs or illustrations or artifacts, artworks. All of my material was layered photomechanical artwork. So people often say, oh, you must have some great artwork in your archive, as you're saying. And I go, well, no, there isn't. I mean, for instance, what would survive for that Planet Earth sleeve? It would just be a piece of cardboard with some pictures stuck on it and a tracing paper overlay with some instructions to the printer with what to do with it. Where's that? God knows.
But when you go through those job bags and you do find some really good items, are you going to do something with it in 2026?
No, I'm going to do something with it in 2027 because, looping back a bit to that very first record sleeve I designed for Buzzcocks when I was a student, that was released on October the 22nd, I think. I'll have to check the date. October the 22nd, 1977. So the 50th anniversary of the first piece of work that had the name Assorted Images on it, which was the name I adopted as my design company, will be 50 years old in October 2027. So that's the target date to do something with it.
Have you got something sort of tenuously planned?
No. I said right at the beginning, I don't plan stuff. There are thoughts, and I work with people who have plans. So my only plan at the moment is to spend enough time in 2026 liberating that material and working out what's there. And from that material, the way it can be presented, whether that's a book, a series of magazines, an exhibition, a record, whatever the way that manifests itself in the following year will be settled next year. I'm being contrary. Yes, there is a sort of outline plan. The person who never plans anything is forcing himself to plan something.
But you've got some good people around you who are making a plan. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was one of the great things about as I grew up in public and I created, if you like, my freelance business, which became a design company. And I attracted lots of other designers to come and work with me. Something that was important to me when building the design studio was as well as employing people who could help out with stuff, I liked to associate myself with people who did things other than what I did. And so Assorted Images was never a studio that was just Malcolm Garrett and some clones. It was a studio that had lots of other designers, many of whom were better designers than me. And I'm thinking Gary Mowat, David Crow, Nigel Proctor, Baker Dave, Damien Whaling, Stephen Appleby. We created a space which kept on just growing and growing with better and better talents. And of course, I went into business with the former editor of New Sounds, New Styles, Casper de Graaf, who was much more organized than I am. That's why he was an editor. He was able to edit me to a degree. We never actually fell out. We didn't always see eye to eye on stuff, but we liked to ensure that we saw when the other person had the most appropriate idea or approach to something and could recognize that and go with it. And so Casper will have a lot of good ideas. We're working with Nigel Proctor, who was one of our designers from 1984 onwards, and he operates now in the publishing world, and he's very keen to work with us. Obviously, all the people who worked at Assorted Images, I'm thankful to hear, were very passionate about working there, and they have fond memories, and they're as excited about celebrating that period of time as I am. And thankfully, I think we've got enough time to do something quite good.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
We're based here recording at the Pixiu podcast studio in Shoreditch. And you said back in the day you had a studio across the street.
Literally across the street.
Yeah, literally across the street. And how much the whole area has changed.
Dramatic.
Yeah.
It's dramatic. I like to say, and I'm not entirely sure this is 100% true, that Assorted Images was the first design company in Shoreditch. We moved in June 1983. I do know that Barney Bubbles had a temporary studio just round the corner on Paul Street. and the photographers Chris Gabrin, who I worked with a lot, Peter Makatich, and the artist Dennis Marzi, and the musician John Fox, who I worked with. They had a building round the corner on Holywell Lane. There was photo studio, art studio, and recording studio. And there was the clothing shop Flip, and actually not much else. You could come to Shoreditch on a Saturday, and it was like tumbleweeds blowing down Curtain Road. It was deserted. And we took on a warehouse space at 120 Curtain Road, and we moved in along with some other people, some like-minded people. So there was Tim Milne, who set up a screen printing company, Artomatic. There was Andy the furniture maker, Kim West, who made latex clothing. There was Annie Simons, who's now a super successful costume designer in film. Stephen Appleby set up his studio there. Richard Boot, who was a musician's manager, set up rehearsal studios, which then became a recording studio, and then a restaurant or cafe or bar, call it what you will, which is still there, the Strong Room. And it just, the whole building grew. And it was, we always had this idea that it should be like, the model in some ways was Andy Warhol's factory in New York. But in many ways it wasn't like that, because the factory was always about Andy Warhol and about his work, whereas we called the building the Bank, which is why the recording studio ended up being called the Strong Room. And it was never about one individual. It was about all of this range of individuals operating in different disciplines. I can't remember where I started with this.
But, I was just talking general about how the area's changed here so much, and you were here,
trying to change it.
The area started to kind of even before,
because the space existed.
Yeah.
Before that, I shared a studio space with Richard Boot. He managed a band called the Yachts, who I worked with, and we had a studio space for 3 years on Tottenham Court Road, which was amazing. And then our ambitions grew too big for that. And the space we could afford in that area of London did not exist. But there was masses of empty warehouse space in Shoreditch. And so that's where we started looking. And we took on, as I say, this entire building, 3 floors of empty warehouse.
Yeah, and I love the idea of the community that you had back then. It must have been really interesting. And obviously it's kind of way before the social media kind of times that we have now.
Oh, absolutely.
Very much DIY. I'd love to know more about how you kind of connected and maybe promoted each other.
I'm not quite sure that we actively tried to promote one another. We just promoted one another by default because we were all here. And some of us worked with one another. I obviously worked with Artomatic. I used them as a screen printing company. Artomatic introduced us to a young up-and-coming racing enthusiast who raced motorbikes at Brands Hatch and elsewhere, called Damon Hill. And Damon Hill stored and maintained his Yamaha motorbikes on the ground floor of 120 Curtain Road. And so it's like, oh, you want to move into motor racing? Here's an artist manager, Richard, and by this time Casper had moved it. So we took over managing Damon and introduced him to Formula Ford. So we helped move him from 2 wheels to 4 wheels. So that kind of thing happened. Again, we didn't plan, let's move into Shoreditch so we'll have space for a racing driver. It's like, oh, here is a racing driver. What can we do?
And I'm right in thinking that Jamie Reid was part of
Jamie Reid
of the group as well. Yeah.
Well, Jamie was great. Obviously, I knew his work, was inspired by his work. And through punk connections, I'd met the writer, John Savage, who wrote for the NME. So I met him in 78. And I'm trying to get the timeline right here now. So come 1983, I think, John Savage had met and started to promote Jamie because of the Sex Pistols connections. We all adored the work he'd done for the Sex Pistols. And John had got an opportunity to work with Jamie and curate an exhibition at Hamilton's Gallery I can't remember the details of how these things happen, but I went on to produce a sort of broadsheet catalogue for the show. Out of that, we got a publishing deal to produce a book, which was published by Faber and Faber, called Up They Rise. And during the production of that book, effectively, Jamie moved into our studio because we were working together, and Jamie was that kind of guy.
We've kind of talked quite a lot about the past. I want to kind of bridge that a little bit and talk about how you embraced digital early. I believe it's 1990, you took the studio fully digital.
Yeah, but before that, I mean, I always had a huge interest in technology, if you like, but the technology of the future. So I grew up with Thunderbirds, let's say, and through the white heat of the 60s, the space race, everything technological and futuristic and sci-fi was inspiring me as a school kid. In fact, I've just curated an exhibition of Jerry Anderson at Toys and Memorabilia. Again, these things happen sort of not necessarily you going out to look for them, but you seeing them when they come walking through the door. And a friend of Richard Boots had a software company, and they wanted to package the software that they were making for the Apple computer before Macintosh. And it was a drawing system. And so Richard introduced us to Robocom, as they were called, to look at packaging their drawing software and their physical hardware. Before there was a mouse, they had a joystick controller called a bit stick, which drew directly onto an Apple monitor, a Sony monitor connected to an Apple IIe computer. And in order to become fully conversant with this software, we got in two of these systems into the studio. So I think that would have been 1983. It was shortly after we'd moved into Curtin Road, but before Apple had subsequently launched Macintosh, we had Apple computers in the studio. We were also sending all of our typesetting out, and that began to be typeset digitally. That was set on a system called CompuGraphic at the Printed Word, just down Old Street. We also worked with a repro company who were experimenting with digital. They had a system called Cytex, short for Scientific Textiles, which was a huge room-sized computer. This is like classic 1960s, spinning tapes in an air-conditioned room to do what was called page planning. When we sent off a flat artwork, layered artwork, a mechanical artwork that we were talking about earlier, to the printer, that would go through a stage called repro to convert our artwork first into films and then into printing plates so it could be printed. And Cytex was a digital intervention between the mechanical artwork and generating the films. So there were three digital components being developed side by side, as far as I could see it. There was the drawing system in the studio, there was a typesetting system down the street, and then there was the page planning system. And I just thought, wouldn't it be great if these systems could talk to one another? Then what happens? Apple launched Macintosh, and not only could the systems talk to one another, they were all in the same box. I mean, they weren't in that same box quite yet, because the system was just black and white and it was a tiny screen. But as some famous person once said, you don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind's blowing. And so my enthusiasm for all things digital in my head was realizable sometime in the future. And we should get on board now. So I think we bought the first Macintosh computers in 1986. But as you just said, we were finally able to throw away all the drawing boards and go totally digital. And we genuinely were pioneers come the beginning of 1990. I remember it's 1990 because Adobe had introduced Illustrator, and it was Illustrator 88. And one of the projects we were doing was for the Design Museum, and it was called Sport 90. So I know it was right at the beginning of 1990. Interestingly enough, at the same time, Neville was launching Fuse magazine, which Monotype acquired the rights to in due course. And I was one of the first designers that Neville asked to design a typeface for the first issue of Fuse. So a lot of things were happening in like January, February at the beginning of 1990. And it was still ambitious. Although we were able to generate artworks digitally, I'm not sure that we were able to go to full color repro at that point. But for me, it was just a matter of time. It was going to happen. You don't fight these things, you get behind it.
Oh, I love that. And I remember Fuse. I remember that whole kind of introduction of the Apple Mac. I was just starting university then in 1990. Right. Okay. So it was a quick switch, really. We started with type scales and kind of rotring pens. And then in the second term, we had a computer room with Apple Classics.
That was the interesting thing, that all the design colleges had rooms. You had to go into a separate room.
You had to book a slot. Yeah. And
even the idea that you could have your own desktop computer was still some way in the future. I was thinking about this the other day. Because pre-computer, you worked on big drawing boards, and they were A0 or something. They were massive drawing boards. And I think I had this kind of half notion that what I really wanted was something that big that was a digital screen. So I could work on a drawing board, but it was working directly into the computer. And of course, the first Mac Plus, the screen was about half the size of an A4 sheet of paper. It was nowhere near a drawing board. It's sort of got as almost to the size of those drawing boards because people work on multiple monitors now. So the ergonomics have evolved in a slightly different way because it's very difficult to kind of imagine something that doesn't exist. And so for me, what existed is you do your graphic design on a big drawing board and it's going to be digital. So quite naturally, the drawing board is going to be a digital drawing board, which it never quite became.
Yeah, so for someone who was really kind of leading in digital out of your own interest and passion for the future of technology, I'd love to know how you see things now. So we've gone through so many kind of changes in our industry, and we are where we are now with kind of AI.
I was going to say, you're obviously alluding to AI.
I can't avoid it, can I?
Which I'm really excited about. In the same way that actually when the Macintosh was first introduced, for the first few years, there was a huge resistance to using anything digital in graphic design studios. Some of the bigger agencies would not have these computery things. And as we said, even art colleges had them in separate rooms, because at art college, you kind of make a mess. Your mess isn't on a screen. So I became a bit of an evangelist. And it was interesting because my ambitions for what I'd like to think could be done digitally weren't realizable because the technology didn't work with that sophistication at that point. But it was definitely going to go that way. And I thought, well, not quite if it can happen, it should happen, but it was definitely going to happen. So turn it to your advantage. And, there's a lot of talk of like, oh, computer's just another tool. Well, it is a tool, but it was also something much more than that. It was many more things. And as soon as it got connected globally through the internet, and it shrank to the size of something you could hold in your hand, the world changed forever. Whilst it was not possible to visualize, especially if you weren't Steve Jobs, it wasn't possible to visualize the iPhone when you had your little black and white Mac Plus, a bit of you knew that it was going to go somewhere like that. And yes, there are a lot of downsides and problems through the iPhone and social media and the effect it's having on the younger generation and all that stuff you criticize. It's also done some amazing stuff that is fantastic. And I think the same about AI. There's a lot of resistance. Oh, it's going to take over the world. It's going to put people out of jobs, whatever all the criticisms are. I'm sure most of those criticisms, if not all, are valid in some way. But it's our job to make sure that all the good bits happen. And it is exciting. And I've just started to work myself with AI, both in terms of visualization and exploring ideas, discussing with AI how to go about doing something. And it finds the information you want and helps you put it in context. And already it's proving really brilliant. So I'm very excited again. I'm as excited about AI as I was about the future of digital technology at the beginning of the 90s.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said. I look back at the Apple Mac introduction, and I had an uncle who had a typesetting business on Liverpool Road in Islington.
Oh, yeah.
And I think his business went out of business actually because of desktop publishing.
Sure.
But, it allowed us as designers to not have the out-of-house typesetting and bring that
together.
There were a lot
of critics of desktop publishing as it being inferior to real design. And in many ways it could be. But in many other ways, it was a total boon. And I always like to think that as a graphic designer at that point in time, very few of the people you worked with or worked for actually knew what graphic design was. They weren't sure what they were asking you to do or how you went about doing it. But as soon as they began to encounter desktop publishing, for a better word, for themselves, they began to realize, oh, there are these things called typefaces. There are things called layout. You can't do everything in Microsoft Word. And so the understanding of what a professional in that field could do was enhanced, which in many ways meant that you were able to do a better job because you weren't having to explain the basics before you could do something sophisticated. You moved straight to working with the ideas and working with where your end results were meant to go. And so the idea that giving somebody a very sophisticated piece of equipment, which is what the desktop computer is, and being critical of them because they don't know how to use it fully, that's fine. They just learn stuff. It's a little bit like saying we shouldn't give people typewriters because they're not writers. It's like, but they might be writers. And, they might discover a hidden range of talents, or they might discover they don't have a talent. The idea that computers democratized publishing and design and communications, I think is fantastic.
We've got time for a couple more topics. So one of them I can't avoid, and that's your link between Manchester and London, two very different cities. You live in London, but your roots are firmly in Manchester, and you still maintain really strong links with Manchester. I'd love to hear about, how you see that kind of shift in creativity, if there is one. What's the difference between the two, and what do you love about each?
That bit of the question I can't answer. I don't. But what I can say is that I had to leave Manchester because, as I said, earlier on in this conversation, I was already working in a music industry that was based in London when I graduated. So just the physicality of it meant I had to move. I wouldn't have to move now, which is the great thing. Amazing things have happened in Manchester since 1978. And although my parents were from Liverpool and I grew up in mid-Cheshire, there were two railway lines. One went to Liverpool and one went to Manchester. And so I had options to go to either as a teenager for going out at weekends. From the age of 11 onwards, when I went to a Catholic boys' grammar school in Greater Manchester, I slowly became Mancunian, to the extent that now when I get off the train at Piccadilly in Manchester and I literally walk out into the streets, it's a strange feeling. I suddenly feel this is sort of my home. Up until quite late on, maybe 10 years or more after I left Manchester, I hadn't realized how comfortable I was with being Mancunian. I always compared it to the last creatures to notice the water are the fish because they just feel comfortable there. And so Manchester is my water. And so I really, really enjoy going there. I maintain relationships with a lot of Mancunians and a lot of Mancunian organizations and Manchester School of Art. And I just love Manchester. What shocks me is that I went to a grammar school in Greater Manchester, and at no point was I taught any of the incredible history of Manchester. In the Industrial Revolution, it's arguable that it was the greatest and most important city on the planet because it was right at the center of so many things. And none of that was impressed upon me as a schoolboy. I only learnt of things later. You know, I learned that the first passenger railway station was in Manchester. The first stored program computer came from Manchester. So many things were either invented there or developed there. Again, and it was all technology. It was a technological powerhouse. And alongside that, you've got workers' rights and you've got the suffragettes. You've got so many things moving hand in hand that are incredibly important. And now I'm really proud to be able to talk about those and to say I come from a city that has that heritage, that industrial strength.
Unfortunately, we should have put this for a whole day, shouldn't we, really? Yeah. I'm sure you
I did warn you.
But we're coming to a close now, and I want to close with some quick fire questions.
Okay.
So hopefully a bit of fun for you. So if you could instantly master any creative skill you don't already have, what would it be?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I'm going to say something that I don't particularly want to do, but always astounds me, and that is sculpture. I look at some of the sculpture from antiquity and I think, how can a person with a hammer and chisel away at a piece of marble and end up with that? And I just think it's astounding.
So let's move to the second question. This is a good one relating to your archive. So If it was to go up in flames, what would you grab first?
Oh, God. I think if it was going up in flames, I'd probably go, fuck it. Have the lot, because I can never single any one thing out, which is why I'm a graphic designer, because the thing that needs to be presented to the world is always dictated by who it's for or who's saying it. And so I don't have to choose. I don't have to choose between Simple Minds and Duran Duran. If we're working on Duran today, it's Duran. If we're working on Simple Minds, it's Simple Minds. So I could say, if the exhibition that I've just curated for Jerry Anderson went up in flames, the one thing I would pull out and save is my Lady Penelope Fab 1 pink Rolls Royce that I still have from when I was 10 years old and is on display in one of the cabinets in that show. I would save that.
Yeah, that would be a good one. What was the name of the chauffeur?
Parker.
Parker, yeah. I always remember that face.
Yes. Yes, milady.
Yes, milady.
When you start a new project, what do you trust more? Your head, your heart, or your gut?
I hate the phrase, oh, I just trust my gut. So definitely not. I think my heart is always inherent in everything, but it's got to be my head. For me, it's always about intelligence, thinking, connecting your head to somebody else's head in some way. So definitely head.
If your life had a soundtrack album, what would the opening track be called?
Okay, I'm going back to Simple Minds now. Someone, Somewhere in Summertime. I just think is such a wonderful framework for living.
Obviously, you worked with some amazing musical artists, Simple Minds, Duran Duran, the Buzzcocks, and many more, magazine as well. I'd love to know what you're listening to now.
There's two types of music, or not two types, two strands of music. And one is what I tell young students nowadays, that whatever they were listening to when they were 16 years old, they will listen to forever. So I'm still listening to some of those albums that I discovered in my mid-teens, I guess. So that might be Hawkwind, might even be Led Zeppelin, but bands that I discovered as I was discovering myself. And you find yourself listening to bands that help you inform yourself about your own likes and your own personality. So I'm still listening to that stuff. In fact, I'm going back buying records I didn't necessarily own at that time, or my friends owned, or they were albums that I was interested in, but for whatever reason, never heard. So I'm listening to a lot of stuff from the early to mid 70s. I'm also very, very interested in contemporary music, what's going on now. And I can never remember the names of bands when I'm asked a question like this, but there are plenty. I love Billie Eilish, for instance. I thought her soundtrack for the Bond movie was classic in the 60s tradition. It was like a Shirley Bassey or a Tom Jones, but it was totally contemporary. I'm also very, very intrigued, and I'm very interested in the whole mystique of the success of Taylor Swift. What is it that's so magical about that woman? In the same way that I was excited and interested in the Spice Girls in the 90s, I'm interested in cultural phenomena. And so I recognize the fact that no way was I ever the target audience for the Spice Girls. I was not the target audience for Taylor Swift. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'd go home and put on a Taylor Swift album, but their influence and their effect on contemporary culture is really interesting to me.
We said that we would find some unexpected revelations or new material on you that people wouldn't know. So how many people knew that you were a Swiftie? No one.
One or two.
And finally, we ask this of all of our guests. Describe yourself as a creative character using only 3 words.
Contrary, interested, fill in the blank.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you.
To check out Malcolm's work, go to his website, which is Malcolm Garrett. I'm going to spell that for you. GARRETT.com. malcolmgarrett.com. Thanks for listening. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate us, and share us with a friend. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan.
That was the last episode of our 5th season of Creative Characters. I want to personally thank everyone who's been listening and following along with us for these past 5 years. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday, whatever holiday you celebrate, and a Happy New Year. We'll see you again in 2026.